I left and I came back after meditating on what I heard. Mr. Glick, I felt like I made progress in that it appears that according to your analysis, although I think my two minority would disagree, this only pertains the mitigation to fugitive and to construction associated greenhouse gases. I'll come to that in a second. But then as Cortez Masto was asking, and asked about the mitigation, and then I think this kind of pivots on the word encourage, because my minority members feel like that is a coercive, pregnant, you've got a lot of encourage, you better do it sort of thing if you want to get it done. And you're kind of soft pedaling as in, no, it's very limited here. But when Cortez Masto asked, what about people mitigating? And you said kind of with a triumphant voice, or at least a very pleased voice, yes, there's some operators who've already offered plans to mitigate downstream emissions. Now, that tells me they didn't understand it is only the fugitive and construction associated emissions. And it also makes me think that Mr. Danley is right in terms of his interpretation, as this is a word pregnant with the potential for coercion and denial of a permit. So I've got a little bit of a disconnect between what I've been told and what I heard.
Thank you, Senator. I don't know about the triumphant voice, but I will try to explain further. There are an enormous number of environmental impacts that we look at, the Commission looks at for every proposed natural gas project, all the way from wetlands and water quality and air quality. I mentioned a whole bunch of them earlier. I'm not going to do that again for the record. But the point is, sometimes we encourage companies for all those potential impacts to come in and mitigate those impacts to the extent they can. And if they can't, sometimes we require that, if they don't come in with the proposed mitigation, sometimes we require additional mitigation, and sometimes we don't, depending on, again, a case-by-case basis, depending on how significant we think the impact is versus how beneficial we think the project is. And that, again, that we have to do that on the facts of the particular case. So again, for downstream emissions, we're not going to require, and we say it explicitly, greenhouse gas emissions reductions. That doesn't mean companies can't come in and propose
But
it.
why would they do so? Why would they take on that extra expense? It makes me think they felt they were more likely to be approved if they presented a plan to mitigate, which gives me a thought that Danley may be right after all.
So when the Commission considers a project, as the courts have told us, we have to consider the adverse impacts versus the benefits. The greater the benefit of the project, the less the concerns are about the adverse impacts. To the extent there aren't significant benefits with the project, or there are some benefits but not significantly, they don't significantly outweigh the adverse impacts, then it's more likely companies come in and try to mitigate those adverse impacts. So it depends, again, on a case-by-case basis.
That actually seems to start veering more towards Danley. What you told me was very saccharine, only fugitive and construction. But if you make a judgment that the downstream impact outweighs the benefit, and I don't know how in anything but a centrally planned economy can you imagine that, since markets would substitute, there may be a downstream use that you have no clue, ultimately no clue what it's going to do. It may be a downstream and the market will decide, and that will be regardless of what your consideration is.
If those downstream emissions are not reasonably foreseeable, and the courts say they're not always reasonably foreseeable, then we can't consider them.
Lastly, I'm struck about the construction aspect, because we don't require that on roads, and we don't require it on bridges, but you're requiring it here. Are you requiring it on the greenhouse gas impact of making cement? For example, if cement is required as a base for a support system for the pipeline, is the greenhouse gas profile of the manufacturing of the cement part of the consideration?
We don't do that, sir. And I would say that with regard to construction projects, we always look at other environmental impacts associated with those construction projects, such as NOx emissions, such as SOx emissions, particulate matter related to the equipment that is brought upon, like for instance, to do the construction.
That is a very local effect, though. That is not a global effect.
In most cases, that's correct.
Mr. Danley, I would just like, the chair is being so forbearing. Last word to you. If it's only fugitive emissions and only construction, whatever I think of that, is that a more manageable regime than having to mitigate upstream and downstream?
That is more manageable. That is not what the policy statements call for. What it says is that the Commission encourages, and we can load that with however much coercion you want as you read it, it encourages the project sponsors to propose mitigation for reasonably foreseeable downstream emissions. And it then states that the commission will take that into account in its public interest determination. So I think you'd have to be pretty innocent in your outlook and to believe that that is not going to weigh heavily on the minds of any potential project sponsor. One doesn't typically go to one's regulator and flout the regulator's expectations. Expectations are strong things, and so are encouragements. And let's not allow the financiers that pay for our infrastructure and invest in it to be subject to this soft, vague coercion. I do not like it.
I think you're probably right. Thank you.